Thanks, comrades. I just want to check the sound. Am I audible enough? Just give me an indication if I'm audible enough, or just a wave. And if I'm not audible enough, just let me know so that I can adjust. No, thanks a lot. Good evening to everyone. Thank you for tuning in for today's political lesson that will be presented by me. My name is Phiwe Mathe. I define myself as an activist and a Marxist scholar. And today's lecture is basically just to simplify our understanding of global politics using Marxism-Leninism as a theoretical tool. So our lecture today is significant for three reasons. The first reason is that we're invited by the Young Communist League, Tishavanga district in the Free State province. And as you know, the Young Communist League is an organization that is dedicated to working class struggles, not only at home, but also across the globe. So this basically implies that the Young Communist League needs to have a global outlook. Of course, its global outlook cannot just be one that is unguided. It is obviously guided by the ideology of Marxism and Leninism. So today is to explore exactly how do we, as young people that are inspired by leftist ideas or the teachings of Marx, what theories or what theoretical canons can we use that can empower us so that we're able to view the world or be able to analyze the social order, which is the global order, under neoliberalism or capitalism, as it were. But before anything else, I think, now I've explained that Marxism is a theory, but I think that we need to also delve deeper into what is meant actually by theory, and what is the use of theory. Theory basically helps us to interpret the world, to make sense of the world. We live in a very complex world that has a lot of interconnectedness and a lot of functions and a lot of actors that operate within the space. So theory in itself is also not neutral, because all theoretical perspectives are there to sustain the interests of certain groups. Now, one famous international relations scholar, who's a critical theorist by the name of Robert Cox, is one who made the famous phrase that theory is always for someone and for something. And in this instance, because we are scholars of Marx, our theory is for two things. Our theory is, one, for the liberation of the working class and the proletariat across the world, because we know that with the advent of globalized capitalism, it has managed to spread its characteristics across all corners of the globe. So that means working class struggles are not only here at home, but they are also experienced quite abroad, although they're experienced differently, but they're more or less experienced in the same way. So All theoretical perspectives obviously have to sustain the interests of certain groups. And we find that we have two kinds of theories. The first theory being the problem-solving theory versus what we call the critical theory. Now, the problem-solving theory essentially is concerned about questions of normativity, questions about how do we solve the current problems that we are faced with. Whilst the critical theory, on the other hand, is a critique of this theory, because the critical theory argues that the problem-solving theory does not seek to change the paradigm. What it essentially does, it finds solutions to ensure that the paradigm is able to sustain itself. Now, you would know that I spoke about theory being theoretical perspectives actually sustaining the interest of certain individuals. So the problem-solving theory basically deals with ensuring that it rearranges the current system, which is the system of neoliberalism within the global space. Whilst the critical theory, on the other hand, challenges the assumptions that it makes. A few examples of the problem-solving theory, or just to use a very practical example, would be if we look at a puzzle. Now, when we look at a puzzle, according to the problem-solving theory, which is a particular outlook on the world, which is more liberal, that comes from the Enlightenment age, but I'll get into that. It does not look at the puzzle from changing the puzzle. What it does, it looks at looking at the puzzle and putting pieces together to the puzzle and not changing the picture and fixing the puzzle as it is. Whilst the critical theory, on the other hand, is a paradigm that stands outside and seeks to criticize not only the puzzle itself, but also the pieces that are used to connect the puzzle. So, in essence, we've got two uses of theory. Theory can either sustain certain frameworks or certain ways of thinking, but the theory can also work to challenge or to change it. So Marxism falls under the strand of critical theory when we look at international relations. But let's get into the origins of critical theory, which is the second point that is part of our presentation today. Now, critical theory was brought about largely by the Frankfurt School, what is called the Frankfurt School, which comprised of scholars such as Adorno, Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, etc. But this was mostly in the 1930s and the 1940s. And what is significant about this theoretical perspective and these scholars is that they drew their perspectives from Marxism on the idea of the superstructure. You know that the superstructure basically relates to the way in which we relate in society and what flows from thereof, which is related to the economy. Now, later, the Frankfurt School project largely sought to critique what is referred to as enlightenment. Now, the age of enlightenment, as I was saying earlier on, before we got to this point, mainly focused on reason, it focused on science, it focused on emancipation, and it also focused on individual freedom. The age of enlightenment also brought us concepts or theories such as quantum physics and the string theory that help us understand what is happening in the world. As you would know, quantum physics is basically a theoretical framework that helps us understand how things work in the world. But as Marx argued, because the Frankfurt School was inspired by largely the writings of Marx, Marx in his thesis on Feuerbach argued that philosophers have interpreted the world, but they have not done much to change it. So the critical theory essentially was inspired by that. And it also brought critique in terms of the practices that were aligned to the theories that were linked to the age of enlightenment, which were mainly problem-solving theories. One, the belief of individual freedom, which is a liberal concept. The belief in reason. The critical scholars argued that what the Age of Enlightenment tried to produce was essentially the opposite of what it claimed to be. because they blamed the Age of Enlightenment and its theories as causes for totalitarian regimes and the advent of World War II. Because as you know, a lot of these authoritarian regimes use these kind of lofty ideas around individual liberty, around reason, and they also justify their actions through science. But we also found that violence was also justified along these lines as well. So critical scholars basically criticized theories that were linked to the Age of Enlightenment as them causing more harm into the world rather than bringing about peace, as they claimed, and bringing about individual freedom and also bringing about reasoning. So the starting point of the analysis by critical theorists starts from the point of wanting to change the world, because you would recall that, as I stated earlier on, that the critical theorists were not happy with how, the Enlightenment age, or the theories linked to the Enlightenment age, were being produced and the idea that they fed about the world. For example, one of these theories that we can draw on, it's the closest example that we can have, is the idea of the American dream, which is very profound in America. The American dream assumes that, for you to be successful, you need to work hard and get those opportunities. And if you don't work hard, well, then hard luck on you. Then that does not mean that you're fulfilling the American dream. But it also meant that for you to be living the American dream, you had to live in a particular kind of way, or think in a particular way, and see the world from a particular way. So, in essence, it is one of those theories that sought to naturalize a particular framework, which was the thinking around liberalism. So the starting point of the analysis of critical scholars was basically all of this needs to change. Number two, it was that we need a more radical form of change. So the starting point of analysis for the critical scholars is that knowledge is always contingent. The basic explanation for this is that we cannot know things outside our historical and cultural context. One of the famous scholars, or in Marx, or some of the writers in Marxist-Leninism, contributors, also make the point that we derive knowledge from what is the material, or what is the objective material conditions. So this also justifies the fact that the theories at the time that were present were not politically neutral. They were fixed to a particular reality. And the people that were determining those theories obviously were people that were within elite circles. So the knowledge that emerges out of those kinds of circles is situated within elitist and middle class, or rather, let's say, elitist and bourgeois thinking. So it also meant that whatever the ideas that were espoused or encouraged by those scholars in those societies, it meant that people had to assimilate to that kind of. So as a consequence, where we speak from is very important. And that is one point of the starting point of the analysis. So as a consequence, the only methodology, critical theorists presented a methodology that enabled us to be open to self-reflection and using our individual experiences as well as entry points into our situatedness and the kind of knowledge and perceptions that we produce from there on. Now, this kind of knowledge is very important when we discuss politics because critical theorists believe that all knowledge is political. Now, this includes scientific knowledge, this includes art, this includes engineering, this includes even education and curriculums and institution of higher learning and so forth. So, thus, whatever we consider to be the normal political order is essentially a political statement on its own, and that there are counter theories that make us forget about the social construction of our own reality. Now, this also normalizes ideas of bourgeois thinking, of bourgeois elites, because what they do is that the knowledge production process also becomes political, because the input is meant to produce a particular output at the end of the day. And in that kind of a process, the output that comes out at the end of the day is one that cannot be used against the norm, the dominant social order of the time. So that means that the knowledge essentially was aimed for a specific political end, and that political end was aimed at generating a particular worldview and for people to view society in a specific way. Now, let's get into Marxism now, and this is where Marxism comes into the equation. But I believe that for the purposes of this discussion, we also need to outline what Marxism is in this context. Now, Marxism is two things. It is, one, a political project, and two, it is an analysis of the workings of capitalism. One, it is a political project in the sense that it is aimed at liberating the working class from the clutches of oppression and capitalist, systemic exploitation. So it's a political project to bring about a more just and equal society. In its analysis of the workings of capitalism, it not only looks at capitalism from an economic standpoint and how it functions economically, but it also looks at capitalism as also a cultural project in terms of how capitalism breeds a particular culture and how it influences perceptions of society and its thinking and how it operates. But Marxism, as you would know, particularly after the Cold War, began to lose some favor amongst people because there was a belief that capitalism had ended because of the fall of the Berlin Wall, or what was named as the Iron Curtain at that particular point in time. But Marxism began to resurface itself, not only politically. Well, politically it might be claimed that it was defeated, but it also began to resurface itself as an academic project. Now, it resurfaced itself particularly due to the intensification of globalization. And it sparked more interest in Marxist analysis, because what globalization essentially did is that it intensified the capitalist order. As we stated earlier on in the beginning in our preamble, is that capitalism has had a way of being able to spread itself across the globe through the process of globalization. So as a result of that, there was a realization that capitalist ideas are still firmly entrenched. And that's where the idea of spreading or limiting the relations amongst countries and limiting the spreading of the power of capitalist ideas across the globe also finds expression. Now, when we look at Marxism in international relations, we look at it from two standpoints. We look at it from a materialist and a cultural perspective. Because remember, we spoke about the fact that Marxism does two things. It analyzes capitalism, its inner workings in the culture, but also it is a political project to liberate the working classes of the world. Now, in capitalism, as you know, but now, it's the material aspect of capitalism obviously is grounded on the concept of historical materialism, which was what was drafted originally by Marx and Engels, which basically deals with the development or the evolution of capitalism and how it became the dominant social order. Secondly, how it also divides society along those that own the means of production and those that work and sell their labor. So within this framework of the material conception or the material analysis, this is where theories such as dependency theory, which looks at how world systems effectively function, It analyzes the economic relations between the center and the periphery. Now, when we speak about the center and the periphery in international relations, we look at it in class terms as Marxist. The center, or the core, being the elite or the elite states, as it were, within the global economy and within global politics. Now, the elite states would be those powerful countries that have consolidated themselves into a bloc. Now, we can look at your G8 countries and most of the northern European countries as well. So, there's a particular relationship that these countries have with the states that are deemed to be on the periphery. So they are said to be in the core because they make a lot of the decisions, basically. They make most of the decisions and they dictate the terms and the pace of the development of the capitalist order. And the peripheral states are left no option but either to be co-opted or to comply or try to mimic, at best, the workings of the states that are in the center. But over time, the theory has also been developed further because we had the advent of developing countries that are deemed to be on the semi-peripheral states, and you find those that are in the periphery. So this is where we find that there's the first world and the third world dichotomy that is used to define these kinds of relations. And these relations are basically, in economic terms, these relations are expressed through how these countries trade amongst one another. If we bring it closer to Africa, we can look at the workings of scholars, critical scholars such as Walter Rodney, who spoke about how the relationship between European countries as colonizers and African countries as states that were colonized by them, how the economic relations are. And economic relations were structured in such a way that the countries that were colonized would produce raw materials that would be that would be exported into the mother colonies or the economies of the mother colonies at the time, and how these products would be finished and be produced in that particular place, and they would be able to be gain profit and value would be added unto them. Now, in this kind of a setup, Marxist analysis makes us aware of the relationship that is not benign between these kinds of states, because firstly, the core states would have an interest in seeing the peripheral states not being able to develop their own capacity, because once the states in the periphery, in the semi-periphery, begin to develop the capacity to be able to produce for themselves, it means that they would own the value chains and be able to make profit of the products. And this would create a sort of a displacement of in terms of power in global relations, because it would mean that countries that are in the periphery that are able to gain their productive capacity are able to have more autonomy or sovereignty over the running of their own affairs. And as a result, because they have the productive capacities, they are able to produce for themselves. And now you find that the dependency ratio has been overturned. They are no longer dependent on the mother colonies, but you find that it has been flipped on its head. An example of this would be countries such as Vietnam, for example, countries that have been able to develop a productive capacity. But in this kind of instance, they cannot really be considered as the necessarily peripheral state, but semi-peripheral state, because they are... Oh, sorry, let me just... Okay, sorry about that. So, materialism in international relations forms part of one of the two strands of Marxism. So, the study of culture as well is also another assessment that critical thinkers or critical scholars of Marxism also look at when they're analyzing the inner workings of capitalism. And these, as I said earlier on, are what are referred to as members of the Frankfurt School. Now, their focus was on the way in which capitalism naturalizes itself through culture. So, the famous author on this particular subject would be Italian Marxist by the name of Antonio Gramsci, who developed the concept that is referred to as hegemony. Now, in developing this element of culture, Antonio Gramsci posed a few questions to himself in trying to understand why didn't the revolution take place in the context of the development of the Industrial Revolution in most European countries. Why is it possible that why was it that the revolution could not take place despite the harsh conditions that people were being subjected to due to industrialization and the development of capitalism? He asked this question specifically because in that particular era, the socialist revolution only occurred in one particular country that was not as industrialized as its other neighbors that were more in the northeastern parts of Europe, and this country was Russia. Russia was an agricultural, country. It was not the most sophisticated, but it was able to sustain itself and have that revolution that took place, that was led by the likes of Lenin, by the Bolsheviks, and the whole equation around the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks that later developed to that point. So his question was, why is it that people are not revolting even though they can see that the system is oppressing them? And his second question was also, how is it possible that people are not able to see their interests properly? Because they could see that the interests were being violated, because at the time capitalists were investing more in machines, and they were paying workers less, and they were taking the surplus labor or the surplus profit, either investing it in more machines and having more mass retrenchments, and in other instances workers were being exploited because they had to work for menial wages which were not in line with their productivity. So in this equation, Antonio Gramsci brought this dynamic and came to the conclusion that the bourgeoisie is not only in political power, but that it also controls institutions such as the church, education, and media. And through the control of these things, it is able to impose its hegemony on workers. And it is able in the process to present its values as being universal. So Antonio Gramsci's contribution to Marxism in analyzing international relations brought about the significant element about the appropriation of capitalist culture. We see this when we look at the current day. Perhaps when you look at South Africa, for example, in the advent of South Africa being able to access social media. We also look at what we call the MTV generation, the generation of music videos and the portrayal of the lifestyle of Americans and the particular values that they espouse that are presented to other countries as the most ideal form, and they're glamorized, and there's a lot of investment into these kinds of things. So the media is not only the only institution that the capitalist order was able to control in order to entrench its culture. It also looked at questions of religion as well. And Gramsci, at this point in time, saw how religion was being used as a tool to sort of subdue the workers in order to make them believe that the suffering that they were enduring was all fair and well, and that it was God's work, and that they need not revolt against this, but they should rather assimilate and try to improve it, as it were. So essentially, the problem-solving theory here that I spoke about in the beginning, and the statement, the famous quote by Robert Cox about theory being for someone and actually being for something. This is where Antonio Gramsci was able to identify these kinds of things. So as Marxists, when we analyze, for example, the current developments within the global politics, let's take, for example, the way in which the USA has been conducting itself in relation to China. or the US, the way the USA conducts itself in relation to countries that have of Islamic faith, and the way it portrays them to be countries that are inherently evil. And it gives off the impression that we cannot view certain sections or certain people of the world as being normal, and that whenever we come across certain countries, we should have these kinds of perceptions that these countries are inherently bad and that these countries need to be destroyed. So hegemony is not just top-down. For it to be entrenched, it needs to be internalized by the working class. And it, at the end of the day, naturalizes exploitation and regards it as the normal state of affairs. So Marxism has these two strands when it looks into international relations. So this brings us to the initial theory that I touched on, which is the world systems theory. I also made an example about the exchange between the raw materials and manufactured goods. I think, and by way of example, we can also further extend this thing by looking at simple things such as coffee. A country such as Colombia. Colombia was once a country that produced, in terms of tons, the largest quantity of coffee. But its coffee was exported to Britain and it was produced in Britain. So you'd find that someone in Britain would be drinking coffee that's produced in Britain, whereas actually the raw beans are taken from a different country. And as you know, profit is generated from the finished product. We can also draw another example, a relevant example to our own situation in our own country, which is South Africa, when we look at commodities. Or we can also look at commodity producing countries in the world. Most commodity producing countries in the world are found in the third world. And they are mainly exploited because they do not have the productive capacity to produce finished goods from those raw materials. We can look at the platinum group of metals. Platinum is used to produce a lot of things in the world, yet a country such as ours that produces a significant amount, one of the largest volumes of platinum group metals or chrome or platinum, is not able to benefit from that. This is the process of beneficiation. So the beneficiation comes also from the finished products as well that have been made. So in this kind of a situation, the class divisions among states are perpetuated as a result of this kind of arrangement, because you've got the developed north that continues to control the pace, the depth, and also controls the innovation. And then you've got the less developed south, or the developing south, that is always trying to catch up. And the central question in this whole equation is, why is it that the developing south is unable to bridge the gap that is constantly being created between it? I think a relevant example of this would be the word on everybody's tongue right now, which is the fourth industrial revolution. Many people have been saying that Africa can embrace the fourth industrial revolution. However, there are some real structural issues that Africa is contending with. The fact that Africa does not have the same capacity and capabilities and infrastructure to be able to benefit from the fourth industrial revolution, because it does not command the kind of resources in order to be able to invest in these kinds of things. So in essence, there's the advancement of something in the north, but we find that in the south, it is imposed on the south, and the south does not really have any room for it to be able to produce its own and be able to catch up and also be in competition with this. So this is summarized into one theory. This theory is called the dependency theory. As I alluded to, that it speaks about the exchanges between these kinds of things. But the dependency theory was also further developed by another scholar called Emmanuel Wallerstein. And he added the aspect of semi-peripheral, of the semi-periphery, because he believes that the semi-periphery are those states that are able to mitigate the tension within the system. Because as I alluded, that already the tension that exists within the system of global politics, or the global system that we have, is that you've got the developed north that is controlling everything, and you've got the developing south that is being exploited, that is contributing, but it is not benefiting from the whole process. So in this kind of a situation, Wallerstein also goes on to further elaborate that there's a particular characteristics within the capitalist system, and this links him back to the point that Marx made about capitalism being a system that is plagued by inherent crises, or booms and busts, if you will. Now, in the international system, we also find those kinds of cyclical rhythms, as they call it, which are composed of recurrent breakdowns within the system. But in most instances, the system, which is the capitalist system, the neoliberal order of things, is always able to reinvent itself. So, for example, we can look at the 2008 and 2009 global recession, and how that also symbolized the failure of capitalism, because capitalism is prone by what is referred to as a race to the bottom. It is based on the accumulating and accumulating and accumulating, whilst extracting from other people and unfairly compensating them, to a point where the system itself begins to collapse as a result of that. So, owing to that, those are the kinds of trends that are most often determined. But Wallerstein posits that the semi-peripheral states, which are the ones that are in between and that are able to mitigate these tensions, are ones which are able to adapt to some of the changes that are there. Now, and this is where we bring in the work of rating agencies and also funding institutions for development finance. So these states that are in the semi-periphery largely are able to gain access to credit, and are able to gain access to quite a wide range of things. But of course, this comes with certain restrictions, which are referred to as conditionalities. And these kinds of things are the ones that dictate to these countries what they can and what they cannot do, and of course how they must also control their macroeconomic environment, as it were. So in essence, we find that the state sovereignty of most of these countries is undermined as a result of this. But it is not, they are not undermined out of their own will. It is basically how the global order has been set up. Now, further studies into, using Marxism as a theoretical tool of analyzing global politics posits that politics in globalization, or politics of globalization, are a set of practices that are imbued with power. That is to say, there's nothing that is innocent that happens within the global system, and that each and every development and each and every decision is done with the aim of trying to either, one, entrench the power of the elites, two, or to try and rework the system and make sure that there's universalism, for other countries to comply with. And this is referred to by a critical scholar by the name of Stephen Gill, who speaks about market civilization. Now, according to Gill, the neoliberal order we live in is in actual fact a disciplining order, because what it does, it uses a carrot and stick method. For those that want to comply and those that want to succeed and want to join the club, it provides incentives, which is the carrot. And like I spoke about, the semi-peripheral states that normally have access to credit and are normally able to borrow. And then there's also the politics of aid, for example, as well. So pure countries that are able to respond to the carrot are obviously, rewarded with certain incentives, and they become the darlings of the West as they've been framed. Now, this is the aspect that rewards compliance and rewards the internalization of the current order. But for the international system and states that do not subscribe to the current order, it has an element of disciplining them. The most famous example of this would be the example of Cuba, and how the country of Cuba was persecuted by the United States of America through various sanctions such as trade embargoes, travel bans, in order to discipline that country, in order for it to move away from embracing socialist ideas that sought to alter the international order and challenge the neoliberal order of things. So sanctions are also used as another mechanism by the developing north, or the elite countries, or the core states, as it were, to be able to further entrench neoliberal order in that way. So this is also a complex system through various instruments that are used. So this process invariably leads to commodification, because the neoliberal order is about the market. It's a market fundamentalist model. It views each and every single aspect of life as a commodity. It commodifies education, it commodifies nature, it commodifies almost each and every single thing. Now, under market civilization, we also find that we have strange phenomena that indicate to us how the capitalist order is incorrect, or the neoliberal order actually harms us as human beings. And this is also through its culture. For example, the destruction of trees and the destruction of lawns and the building of artificial things in order to make humans believe that they actually can receive those things, whereas this is actually an illusion that does not speak to the real kind of thing, because everything under capitalism has been commodified. So market civilization also puts forward the belief that the market is able to self-regulate through its own mechanisms, and that you do not need the intervention of the state. And now this is where it creates a problem, because the markets themselves favor a particular world order, and they favor a particular order of society to transpire. And this is where the role of the state becomes critical, because the state now becomes a middle ground that seeks to manage the contradictions between these two social forces. So within international relations, we see this in the relationship between the different states that buy into the world order and market civilization within this. Now, another important aspect is, what do we do? This is another aspect that Stephen Gill actually advances on, because he speaks about ways in which progressive countries that are critical of the current world order can be able to resist this order. Now, one of those mechanisms is, if we can draw a relevant example now, is the formation of the BRICS countries, because it's an organization, so economic or trading bloc of countries that are in the global south that want to change the global order, and they do not want to necessarily subscribe to the dictates of the current order under the Bretton Woods institutions, your IMF, your World Bank, and so forth. So ways in which this can be resisted is by delinking, which is a theory that is also advanced by another Marxist scholar by the name of Samir Amin, that developing countries, or the underdeveloped South, should try to delink itself by creating alternatives to the existing order that is under the global politics, neoliberal order, Now, these kinds of strategies fall under some of the strategies that do not seek to replicate the problem, but find an alternative to the problem. So, Marxism helps us to problematize, number one, the global system and all its instruments that it uses. Instruments such as development financing institutions is one of those instruments. The second is also in terms of trade and foreign aid as well, which are some of those instruments that are used by the global order in order to discipline or try to engender or naturalize the neoliberal order of things. So as a political project, it not only looks at trying to harness the global system and bring about a much more just and equal global system politically. But it also seeks to ensure that in all of these countries there is universal values in terms of respect for the values of the working class and the people who work on the factory floor. So, under the cultural strand of Marxism, just to go back by way of example, remember, the objective of these kinds of lectures is obviously to simplify these kinds of things. And that is why I moved away deliberately from using a lot of technical jargon and just tried to draw up examples. The cultural value of Marxism is also in today's world and also in today's global politics is also advanced through the academy. The academy, for example, is compounded by two things. The academy is compounded by questions of control of the knowledge production processes. That is to say, what we normally find within the global system is that the countries that are deemed to be the core states are often the ones that are leading and driving the knowledge production processes, and they normally obviously control the knowledge value chains, and they also dictate what is also knowledge. And the knowledge that we gain obviously is not knowledge that is better suited for our own conditions, because it does not seek to explain or try to resolve the complexities that we find ourselves within our own conditions. Remember that the theories are supposed to help us not only make sense of things, but also help us to solve those kinds of things. And if we do not have theories that are critical of the current order and propose an alternative, then it would mean that we have a social order that would be dictated by neoliberalism, which is the current school of thought within the global sphere itself. So, the critique of global capitalism using the lens of Marxism empowers us to be able to better understand and to also prevent instances where we find that developing countries in the global south find themselves caught up in a debt trap or a dependency on institutions that are controlled by countries in the global south or that advance neoliberalism. It also tries to engender the fact that these countries need to develop their own capacities and be able to work amongst themselves as partners in the global south and be able to make a much more just and egalitarian global system. But also that they should move away from seeking to be accommodated within the current neoliberal order of things, because in most instances we find that some of the states, or most developing states, always want the very same neoliberal order or countries that control the current order to be the ones that are changing the system, whereas that does not work in their favor. But the ability or the agency to be able to come up with alternatives is also limited given some of the structural constraints that they find themselves in, which are economic and otherwise. So the importance of alliances within the global south are quite critical in that regard as a form of providing alternative modes of development and also an alternative relations within global politics. So I had dedicated just 45 minutes to just unpacking, just at a basic level, what Marxism has to offer for us in terms of better understanding global politics. But I would like to open for more engagements with you so that we can have a conversation about some of the contemporary issues and perhaps some of the linkages that we draw within Marxist-Leninist literature in relation to an analysis of the global trends. So the use of particular theory, which is essentially critical theory, is also important in as far as being able to think about alternatives that are outside this whole kind of equation. So at the end of the day, we as young people that are inspired by socialist ideas should always try to apply a much more critical view or a critical analysis of the global trends that are evolving within our global politics and not necessarily see events that are unfolding as being isolated, but see how these events are part of a much more complex process of one, either the neoliberal order trying to further entrench itself or it trying to escape or create a crisis in which it can be able to reinvent itself. So, comrades, I appreciate you being able to listen to me for the past 45 minutes. I will now hand over to you and deal with your questions, and we'll respond and have a further conversation on using Marxism as a theoretical tool in understanding our international relations. So I already see that there are some questions that are there. I'll try to respond to some of them that are there. So, Thabiso Lutswara, what opportunities does the current pandemic present for the reinvention of the neoliberal order, considering the consistent to reinvent itself, and what should be the response amongst in essence, we are dealing with a pandemic, a global pandemic. And global pandemic requires us to preserve three things, actually three priorities. One, it is protecting lives, firstly, which is ensuring that populations are not adversely affected by these kinds of things, because we know that economies essentially rely on productive workforces. Number two is the protection of livelihoods, because in as much as we have lives that need to be protected, we have livelihoods, people that have jobs, that are employed, that are able to sustain the economic activities in these different countries. So there's a need to also protect livelihoods as well. And the third one, obviously, is a view on recovering from the economic effects of this. One thing that countries in the developing South and how Marxist scholars can counter such in relation to the question is that there needs to always be a push towards alternative forms of resolving the crisis that we have. For example, there is currently facilities that have been opened by your IMF that are lending out to developing countries. Let's take, for example, countries that are already in economic distress with economies that are not growing. So if a country X decides to take a loan and has to repay it at a particular percentage over time, due to the differences in terms of the economies of scale between the developed and the less developed ones, it is likely to take the less developed countries or in the global south longer for them to recover from the scourge of the pandemic and its economic effects compared to the countries in the north. So in such an instance, we need to strengthen the ties among the countries that are in the global south. And fortunately, certain developments, such as the formation of the BRICS Bank, which was essentially formed as an alternative to this, would need to be pursued. So Marxist scholars in this regard must actively advocate for countries to pursue alternative relief as opposed to alternatives that will put them or have them locked into a debt trap for many more years to come. And then let's see the other question. As African, can we still reference Marx on our way forward, as we agree that Karl Marx's ideology, those Well, one thing about Marx that we need to understand is that it's not about Marx the individual per se. It is about his analysis of the conditions that are prevalent within the capitalist order of doing things. And this is me responding to Microwave Justa Codes. So Marx's ideas or Marx's analysis was purely speaking to how societies and how things function in societies where there is industrialization, and how social forces are relating to one another, and how labor, for example, is misappropriated, and how the modes of production within those countries is likely to be, given the experience of the earliest forms of capitalist mode of development at the time in the Industrial Revolution. So there's really not necessarily much of a distinction that we need to draw about using Marx in Africa because Marx was from Europe. Marx purely looked at ideas that Marx's analysis was purely on the realities of that time in countries or economies that were beginning to industrialize. So because of the global character of capitalism, it uses the same mode of production to replicate itself in different countries. So if in Europe people were being divided along class lines between workers and those that own the means of production, if capitalism reaches African shores, it is likely to replicate the same thing. So Marxist analysis is useful in as far as that is concerned. It is not to say that we follow the ideas of Marx, because they help us look at the world in a much more critical way and be able to develop our own solutions. Kuvava Terence Rasangwati, at the end of the Cold War, what kind of a world have we inherited? Who are the key players? What are the key issues of contention and how are they being shaped? I think I touched on that a bit to say that after the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, as it were, and reading from people like Francis Fukuyama, for example, who had predicted the end of history and how socialism or communism or Marxist ideas would never find expression. The kind of world that we inherited was a world that now had to comply with the dictates of the neoliberal order. Because you would know that the kind of support that was guaranteed for countries that were aligned to the USSR and socialist countries, the support that they had actually had dwindled and they were left unto themselves. And they had no other alternative but to assimilate. But within that context itself, we find that there were other countries that remained resilient as a result of that. So we inherited a world that also had, it moved away from the bipolar system. We had multipolarity, because you would remember that it was necessarily between two poles. It was the East and the West. And after that, we saw the development of different power bases in different continents at the advent of that. What are the key contentions on how are they being shaped? Well, the key contentions have always been around the questions of development. You would know that some post-independence African economies needed to develop, and liberation movements need to assert themselves and produce certain economic policies that were aligned to their own, objectives. And so development financing, or the questions of development and financial aid, and also human aid also came into the picture. So these are the instruments that I referred to from your rating agencies that are sort of the gatekeepers in terms of who should get what and whether who's complying. Well, basically the ones that enforce the discipline, as Gilles had stated. So how do they shape the balance of power and distribution of privilege? The distribution of privilege remains as it is, that the blocks that have organized themselves into elites are the ones that mainly benefit from this. But throughout time, we've seen the development of China. China has also developed as an alternative. It has also developed as a superpower together with Russia. And we've seen a conscious effort by countries of the developing South to try and progressively or gradually de-link themselves from the neoliberal order and not being compelled to assimilate or accept the conditions that are being set by these instruments that are used by the neoliberal order in order to discipline these countries and normalize the neoliberal order. Do you consider it, Georgia Losi, do you consider it an alternative for the Central Bank of South Africa to print in response to COVID-19? Yes, indeed. This is quite a huge debate currently. Look, I'm not one who's an expert on the economy, but I have a fair understanding of how the economy should function. My understanding is that if we have the internal capacity to be able to fund our responses to COVID-19, then why not? Why is it that if we have those facilities, and if it is proven that we have those facilities, do we need to move to accessing funding that comes with repercussions, especially in terms of debt repayments? Like I stated, South Africa currently has a very negative growth outlook, and it is only set to move out of that growth outlook within the next 3 to 5 years. Now, these loans are interest-bearing loans, and by the time South Africa emerges out of the crisis that we're in, because remember, before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were already in an economic recession. So basically, this pandemic, together with the decision of the rating agencies, was a double jeopardy on South Africa, and it leaves South Africa in a very vulnerable position. But if indeed there are alternatives, then those alternatives must be pursued. There's absolutely no reason for us to want to pursue something that's going to leave us indebted for many more years to come. Do you foresee a change in the global economic outlook in the next 100 years? If so, well, 100 years is a lifetime. Well, 100 years is a very long time. But I do see it happening. I do see it happening. But where I see it happening and where I see it starting is within regional blocks. The regional blocks that we have are going to begin to become strengthened, and they're going to begin to become more coordinated. And I believe that they will, in some sort of way, be able to enhance trade amongst themselves and be able to also increase investment amongst themselves. We have different economic blocks here in Africa. We've got the SADC, which is also a developing one. It's growing. We've got ECOMOG, we've got ECOWAS. Cross-continentally, we've got BRICS. If we look at the Latin American states also, there is some sort of that arrangement. So I think if these countries can be resilient enough and be able to invest in their own productive capacities, we would be able to see a change in the balance of forces in the next 100 years or so. Although I doubt that I'll be alive at that time, but definitely it would happen. But as you know, the international system is also filled with class contradictions. You know, it's not to say that those that are for the neoliberal international order would necessarily sit and idle and watch as an alternative is beginning to develop. Obviously, there would be those countries that would obviously move in the opposite direction. Maravani Sidavela, PS, can we agree that due to the pandemic we are seeing the reigniting struggle of international solidarity? Yes, there is that, but there's international solidarity at a human level, you know. It is not solidarity that is expressed in practical terms. And when I say that it's expressed in practical terms, there is no real support for countries amongst themselves. Well, obviously, we're looking at the framework of global politics and how the core and the peripheral states begin to relate to each other. But we've seen develop major powers that are emerging as alternatives, like China, beginning to show and practically express their solidarity to mainly African countries. They express their solidarity to South Africa through, you know, giving out the necessary equipment in order to be able to assist. But also, another way in which we can counter this, because we need to defeat this cycle of dependency, is that there needs to be capacity we need to invest in the productive capacity in terms of manufacturing for most of these countries, so that economies to some extent are able to be resilient enough, you know, when it comes to facing these kinds of pandemics. I see Temba Planetist Freeman. If it happens that the SACP attains socialist revolution, should the character of the ANC as a multi-class organization change? Well, as you know, that the SACP basically posits the Freedom Charter as the most minimum or basic program that can lead us, or the building blocks towards socialism. And once there's a full implementation of that, we'll be able to see. It would mean that the SACP would then be able to take over, because we would have essentially built a country that is more socially just in the country, that would mean that the liberation movement might have been able to change the characteristics as a democratic society that is prosperous, you know. So the ANC is a multi-class organization. I believe that as a multi-class organization, it's going to begin to wither away, because think of it in this sense. Currently, the ANC is ensuring that development is spread across, prosperity is democratized. Now, the more and more people are becoming more affluent and more prosperous, the more they might not see the liberation movement being able to fulfill. The liberation movement would have fulfilled its mission. Now, from there on, we know that in a prosperous society, we would need some sort of element of regulation where we ensure that even though there's prosperity, but there is also access, and that nobody is deprived from all of these things that might have been accrued from our prosperity. So we could be victims of our own achievements. We could have, for example, liberated the mass majority of black Africans, but we could have also created another problem of elevating other people above other classes, because it is not to assume that each and everybody within society will have achieved that level of social mobility. But provided the class contradictions are dealt with, then we will find that order. Mbulelo Jafta, how far is Africa in ending capitalism, imperialism, and achievement of unity? Well, Africa is still far. Africa is still far from defeating, I think, capitalism, because capitalism has entrenched its ways. It has entrenched itself in very sophisticated ways. It has entrenched itself through its markets. It has entrenched itself culturally as well. What would be necessary for African states would be for them to be able to develop their own alternatives. Then again, it goes back to issues of alternatives, because if the current dominant order is not favorable to Africans, and it is not inspiring to Africans, and it essentially alienates Africans from who they are and from what they do and from the current ways that they practice things, then it would mean that Africans need to start consolidating their gains and coming back. Apart from these different platforms, do you see one African currency in lifetime in order to limit the currency? Well, African currency can be positive. It is something that is possible, but we also have to look at how we gradually implement it, because I think that the most practical way in which we can achieve a single currency in Africa would be to strengthen our trade relations and strengthen also the regional blocks that we have in the different regions of Africa. Babaji, it's going to be difficult to reignite the manufacturing sector given the current consumption trends. Okay, that was not the question. But I think if there is sufficient investment into the manufacturing sector, then we'll be able to accrue, because our investment into manufacturing sector would also have to create labor-intensive, jobs that would be able to absorb the large mass of people that are there. And also, it should also create it should also benefit for other sectors, also broadening the manufacturing sector as a base on which we can leverage from. Kuvava again, with Africans finding an alternative for themselves, where will this leave our relations with BRICS countries? Look, relations are based on relations within the global south. African countries are still part of the global south. It would not mean that they are going to move away from their relations with these other countries, because they would need to further consolidate the gains that they would have made in terms of providing a viable alternative to the current order that there is. Let's check other questions. So I don't see any other questions, but we can continue the conversation, comrades. because I still have more time. We can still continue the conversations and the questions can still come in flow. At the end of the day, and I see there's a lot of emphasis on the question of, institutions, development institutions, development financing institutions. The emphasis on development financing institutions, obviously there's been a bad experience, or we've seen horrible experiences, especially for countries in Africa when it comes to the access to development finance, and how they've been caught up in a debt trap, and how structural adjustment policies have also constrained their ability to be able to come up with policies that speak to their direct, and change their macroeconomic environment, and how this has taken away the sovereignty. I think, be that as it may, seeing that that is the major problem, and it has always been the problem that we find ourselves in, it is critical to build more resilient economies. And the president also made this point yesterday about how the economic recovery of South Africa would have to create a brand new economy that would be much more resilient to these kinds of incidences or these kinds of events, such as the pandemic, that would expose us, to I would call the evils of the Bretton Woods institutions. And where I qualify these evils, because these are things that sort of limit the development of African states and the use of their sovereignty. So, in the context of this, I really think that the only way, because what capitalism does, it presents itself as the only solution, and that there's no other alternative. And when we look at things critically, we need to develop alternatives in order for us to also build more resilient economies, and for us to be able to consolidate on the gains that we would have made. So, in large part, we need to continue to study the development of our global politics, and also study the development of Africa in relation to how it shapes global politics, but also the creation of alternative multilateral institutions to counterbalance the current global order of things, and also to undermine some of the instruments that are used to the detriment of Africans, in them being able to achieve a much more just and equilibrium order. So I think that we have exhausted the discussion at length. I want to thank everybody that tuned in, that took out their time to basically understand what Marxism uses in terms of analyzing global politics. And also let me thank the leadership of the Young Communist League in Dishavanga district for also requesting me to make the presentation. And until then, let the discussions and the debates continue, comrades. Like I said, Marxism is just a tool of analysis that helps us look at things. If indeed we find that there are much more appropriate ways or tools of analysis that we can employ, let us do those kinds of things. But we must always seek to construct an alternative reality to the current neoliberal order, because the first point of call to undermining it would require for us to be consolidated and be able to fulfill that mission. So thank you very much, comrades. Aluta continua.